It's the 25th of January 2021, and I'm Mary Braithwaite. And I'm delighted to be talking this morning to Derick Wilson. And we hope we'll hear lots of interesting experiences of Corrymeela connections over the years, Derick. Would you like to start off by telling us a wee bit about who you are?
Oh dear. I'm Derick Wilson. I used to be very young, now I'm old. Um, I grew up in North Belfast, an only child of a nice, hard-working set of Presbyterian parents in Duncairn Gardens. Um, I spent the first 6 years of my life moving from attics of friends and relatives, which was, I think, a feature for many families at that time because there wasn't public housing. I then grew up in Rathcoole, had a very happy time living there, and then ended up on the Shore Road, always associated with McCrory Presbyterian Church, which was a working class liberal Presbyterian church in the Duncairn Gardens. And the Duncairn Gardens turned out to be one of the epicenters of the conflict. McCrory, in fact, was closed during the conflict, but I always had very happy memories of there. And in fact, I never found another church that I could relax in since then, which is part of my struggle with uh, the churches in Ireland. But anyway, that's another story.
So, did your church have lead you towards Corrymeela at all, or?
Well, in an interesting way, I mean, we were daft, crazy people, really, because we had quite wonderful. We had a good clergyman and a very good woman assistant, and they were very worldly wise. So in 1962, when I was 15, we were running Christian Unity services on the Duncairn Gardens. Can you imagine running Christian Unity services in the Duncairn Gardens?
No.
Um, there only were about 25 or 30 people turned up for them, and I think most of them were members of my family or friends. Uh, but it was that sort of church, and through that I met Ray through the youth fellowship, who came to talk about his experiences in Dresden, but also introduced us to the ecumenical movement in the early 60s, 1963, 64. Um, and it was very real for us. He was encouraging us working class Presbyterians to get involved in the wider world, sitting in the middle of Duncairn Gardens. And it was marvellous. Um, and after that, I then heard about Corrymeela actually through an old girlfriend who had given me up. And then in September 65, because I'd met Ray, I went to the first student chaplaincy week at Corrymeela. And that's how I got involved in Corrymeela. It began, I think, June 65. I arrived on a student project September 65 and was completely hooked. Completely
So,
hooked.
so what was Corrymeela like in those days? Can you describe to me uh, what the campus was like? What was going on? What were the facilities? What was the environment like there in those days?
It was it was this old house with a lot of wooden chalets around it. It had a wonderful uh, front facing person called Desney, who was very inclusive and welcoming. And Desney Kempston was the heart and soul of it, along with Billy McAllister. Um, and it was pretty basic, with Anna Glass eventually cooking in the kitchen, everybody helping out. It really was that place where you made your own bed. I mean, I do remember being part of that, and that's not a myth, that's a reality. It was basic accommodation with dormitories, basic accommodation and basic food, very good food. Desney always settled for shepherd's pie. I think she settled for shepherd's pie because none of us really could cook very well. Um, for me, it was a place of unconditional welcome. It was. I still remember those first days. It was a place where an immense sense of freedom. I didn't realize that at the time, but looking back, you were coming out of a world of quite a narrow world of Northern Ireland in the 60s. a very judgmental world, a very, looking back, a very sectarian world. And suddenly you arrived in this place that was both locally relevant and linked to international things.
And that was a time when it was pre-Troubles, really, but
Yeah,
Northern Ireland was working towards the Troubles.
it was pre-Troubles, but then Corrymeela was, it, in '66, it had its political conference. Some of us then ended up going to international work camp, an international work camp at Corrymeela, run by the World Council of Churches that Desney led, where you got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and worked until 1, and then studied in the afternoon, and then had parties in the evening, which is unthinkable now, I suppose. Um, it was also a world that introduced us all to that wider world. So, I spent a month in Agape in 1966. I spent loads of time then getting involved in the work camp movement in Europe, and it was all because of Corrymeela. So it was this wonderful place of meeting and dialogue and openness, and at the same time it was a place that knew it needed to become more. Uh, in the 66, 67, it became that struggle. How did a so-called ecumenical community really be truly ecumenical in Irish terms? Because in fact it was a Protestant place open to Catholics, but it had to become a community of Catholic and Protestant, and that was the struggle in the 66, 67, both in terms of those of us from Protestant traditions having to deal with our own reluctance to really trust this different other that we've been brought up to distrust in our society, and also meeting people from the Catholic tradition who had similar challenges, especially with their tradition. So, each of us were their own. The main problems were our own traditions. The problems weren't each other.
Mm-hmm.
One of my close friends, Connor Bradley, was I think one of the first Catholic members of Corrymeela. He was involved with John Hume later, and he was involved with the National Democratic Party. He was very politically and socially aware, uh, but he also had to deal with people from the Catholic tradition who weren't keen that people should share with Protestants and so on. So all of us had these struggles. But
Mm-hmm.
again, Corrymeela gave you permission to have those struggles. It wasn't trying to avoid them.
And that was a great sense of freedom, of course, to be able to come somewhere where you could be upfront about the things that you were wrestling with, and you could speak more plainly. It's interesting, though, that you talk about the international dimension right from the very early days. How do you go about that? Making those international connections and getting people to come to a work camp.
Well, I think Desney was pretty central to that. Um, but there are also other student groups. The internationalist group in the Presbyterian chaplaincy had a lot of people who were thinking about international development and overseas aid. So there were all those orientations. And when I looked back and did my earlier research in Corrymeela, a number of the founder members had actually also had international experience, and had part of the reconciliation movement in the 60s was people coming back from living in other countries on international development programs, and then coming back to Northern Ireland and feeling cramped. So there was this, I think, creative tension always there. But very quickly, I got. It cost you what, £14 to fly to Geneva. I ended up in the World Council of Churches Youth Service Department as a member of the committee. I travelled there regularly through Corrymeela. I went to Agape and Taizé and spent time. Uh, it was easy to do in those days, in a sense, uh, and Corrymeela gave you those links. But there was always this challenge: how to bring back that type of experience and animate the work camp program and the program at the centre, because it really was a refreshing place to be, a refreshing place to be.
So at the work camps, they were international
There were
people. Then just had.
local and international, mainly
Yeah.
local, for the 3 or 4 summers, 66 onwards, 65 onwards, but 66 when I was involved in work camps. There were these local camps every week from June until
Mhm.
September.
Mhm.
Then Desney and others, and I and others, then we started these. And she had this World Council of Churches work camp in I think '66 for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then out of that, a number of us who were involved in that became involved in international work camps elsewhere. I went to Germany. I then ran an ecumenical work camp in East Belfast, running a play scheme for a month on the Newton Arch Road in Short Strand. So there was always this to and fro of local and international. Um, and it was, I suppose, where people learnt. You learnt to build walls crooked, and Billy would rebuild them. You learnt to have ideas, and Ray would always say to you, if you've got ideas, try and make them a reality. So it was a great time of experimentation. There weren't barriers to innovation. It was wonderful.
Coming back to the local scene, um, there were a lot of summer schemes for children.
Yeah.
Were you involved with those?
Yes, and Dot was involved later too in a Suffolk scheme. Those were a development from the work camp program. So people like uh, David Corky and a lot of other people, they would have run then play schemes in Belfast or worked with folks in Derry. Craig Cameron worked with folks in Derry, where you had a play scheme linked to maybe a residential 4 or 5 days at the centre, and then there'd be a play scheme back in local communities in East Belfast, and so on. And then we ran international work camps that ran play schemes as well. So there was this give and take between the residential programs and ongoing, student work in different communities. Um, Looking back, they probably were very haphazard, they were very happenstance, but they were what people felt they could do in their free time at that time. Um, and it's where many of us, I think, were conscientized to become youth workers or social workers or enter politics or become involved in business with a more sort of social sort of conscience. They were essentially very strong places of making you think in a fresh manner and in an open manner, and always this notion of reconciliation. That this wasn't an airy fairy idea. This was a concrete challenge to find ways to live together with people who we've imbibed distrust about or put distance between us and them. I mean, I remember my first ecumenical work camp at Corrymeela, we had some Jewish people, we had a Muslim, and we had Christians and all sorts of things. I mean, in 1966, it was marvelous.
Mhm.
It was marvelous.
So the children who came to those summer schemes, how do you think it was for them when they went home?
Well, I think this is the old chestnut. Did you take people away and then they went back home? And the nature of our society was everybody was struggling to make new relationships, but that's not a reason not to take people away or not to go away yourself and reimagine things or think about things in a fresh way. So I think some kids, when they came to some of our camps and projects, when they went back home, they probably missed some of that opportunity. They didn't know how to make contacts or have friends across the divide, but that wasn't their fault. That's a structure of how this society worked. I think then that a number of people, not just in Corrymeela, in lots of other voluntary organisations that were emerging in the late 60s, then became involved as youth workers or as teachers or as social workers or community workers with with that wider sense of we need to open this society up. It's not right that kids meet one another in a place and then go back to live separate lives. That's not the children's fault. It's not the family's fault. That's a societal issue. So a lot of people would have been teachers with a community relations focus. A lot of people would have taught in one school, but one of their friends would be from another school, maybe from a Catholic school or a Protestant school, depending on who they were, and they would unofficially twin or even officially twin. And I think quite a lot of people in the 68, 69, 70 period even were beginning to do that or imagine that. Um, so I think it was an issue. What do you do? How do you support people when they go back to separated societies? But we were part of that separation too. It
Yes, I'm thinking about at the moment, it's a time of the pandemic in 2021, and I'm thinking about the R number in terms of Corrymeela
Yeah,
spreading
yeah.
in the community. And the R number obviously was more than one.
I think it probably was. Uh, it probably still didn't make huge inroads, but it was making a statement. It was being a beacon that it was possible to live in another way. Not that we are good and everybody else is bad, but it is possible for ordinary people to do things in a different manner. Um, like Jenny and I worked as 2 out of 4 schools workers. I was in Sandy Road. Jenny Megan was in the on the Shankill, and then the 2 people we paired with were from Short Strand and from the Ardoyne. Now that was a team of four workers, and probably the first cross community team of school workers, brought together by John Malone, and we used Corrymeela for our residential work. So you could say that was a crazy project. It was a wonderful project where 4 of us were able to work across 4 schools on an inter community basis, and it was magic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we made loads of mistakes. We never changed the world, but we were part with John Malone and others of modelling what Ray saw as was needed in the wider society. Model ways of being together and working together that others might then pick up from. Um, and yeah.
Very valuable and very challenging in those days, because as time went on, then the troubles got worse and worse. And sort of moving on into the 70s, this work was still continuing in the 70s and thereafter, was it?
I think it multiplied, and people like Norman Richardson and many others, they formed and Yvonne Naylor and others, they formed that group of informal educators called, which became EMU, Education for Mutual Understanding, and there was quite a growth of that work, um, with people feeling able to do that, either full time or part time or voluntary. Um, and for me, 72 was, I mean, what, 400 or 500 people killed in 72. That was a really tough year. Um, uh, I worked with a guy, Sean Armstrong, who came from Port Ballantrae and who was assassinated. Um, I had a gun put to my head and told to, mind who I was. Certainly for me, 72 was a horrible year at that level. Um, and I probably would have left. Well, I was going to leave Northern Ireland, because it was just a sense of, hopelessness. Um, but Corrymeela was the reason that I stayed, because it was in Corrymeela you met people, you belonged with others, and no matter what the challenges thrown at you were, there was always somebody around who would help you see things in a better light. Um, and I think that's a very important element of Corrymeela, not just then, but I hope now.
So it's had a very significant impact on your life then. It
Yeah,
really determined the direction you went in.
yeah. For me, I struggle with religiosity. I struggle with churches that have been so focused, in my experience, on what I would now call sacred beliefs, and that did not empower people, and often still do not empower people, to take risks and meet the different other. Um, so I wanted to see if there was an understanding of faith that didn't have to be so religiously confined, and Corrymeela offered me that. Um, and I'm very grateful for that, because I do think there's an understanding of the Christian Gospels, uh, that is about the wider world, that is about what the World Council of Churches called justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. That was in 1970. Heavens above, would you ever think of such words having such a long lasting influence?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the churches in Ireland really got stuck and were Ray challenged them. We have to work for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation.
So Corrymeela was really stepping across the boundaries in those days, but at considerable personal risk to people like yourself and others.
I don't think I don't think there was personal risk. I think it was a question of choice, and if you had freedom using it in a society where so many people didn't have freedom. I mean, so many of the families I worked with in Sandy Row, to a certain extent in the markets where Martin worked, um, they didn't have freedom. They couldn't exercise quite a lot of their freedoms economically and socially and culturally. So I think those of us who had freedom had to exercise it. And I think that was really what I learned, with many others learned from Ray.
Mm-hmm.
When I look back now, I think when I went to run the centre in '78, then I met this wonderful man, Peter Tennant. I've only really recently rediscovered some of his early history as a Quaker. He was a Friends ambulance unit driver in the Sino-Japanese War in the late 30s, early 40s. He drove ambulances between the trenches. Uh, and then in 1968, he still pops up and plants all the trees and writes things for the Committee on the Administration of Justice. I mean, historically, we are surrounded by a whole load of people who always exercised whatever freedom they had.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me was what Corrymeela offered all of us. Sorry, I'm rabbiting on a bit there.
No, you're okay. So as time went on, then how did your involvement with Corrymeela progress through the 70s, 80s, 90s?
Yeah. Well, I was going to go on for the church, and thank goodness I never did. Um, Corrymeela helped me get into youth work. It gave me that vision of, working in with young people and youth work. Uh, so I would have used Corrymeela to support my work in schools. Um, I then went and set up the courses to train all the youth workers in the north in '73, I think it was. And again, we had a very dynamic way of looking at how people learn, a transformative learning model, which made use of residentials at places at Corrymeela, so that because we drew students from every social and cultural background, and they all had experienced violence in many big ways, and they needed to learn together. They needed to be, in a sense, a community of reconciliation. We couldn't put that label on them in a public university, but that's essentially how we ran the course, and that was informed by my experience in Corrymeela. So what the learning group that we had in those student days spent hours and hours hearing one another's stories, dealing with one another, struggling with one another. Uh, I then went and became the director of Corrymeela for 7 years in 1978. Um, uh, it was a very exhausting, exhilarating time. Um,
You can
working with
tell
a
me more
wonderful
about that. Yeah.
working with a
What's it like
wonderful
being lead?
staff team. Well, I mean, that was Harold Good had developed the volunteer program, and it really had developed that sort of uh, sense that Corrymeela was an open centre. Um, and so the foundation blocks were there. Ray was still around and always available. Um, and again, we had the freedom to innovate. So we developed youth work, we developed schools work, we developed family work, we developed innovative work with churches on a regional basis, like in Green Island or in Newton Abbey. Uh, Churches would come together through the Corrymeela connection and work together and spend residential time. And we also then had the horrors of intimidation. Um, um, the thing I dreaded most was the phone call with the coded message. One time the code was that the cricket match is off and the people need taken back. It was one of these silly code words, and you knew there's a family that needs picked up. and given refuge. And I think Harold had started that, and it certainly grew in my time because the intimidation levels were very high. So, in addition to being this residential learning centre, where also then in those early days, police officers and nationalist and loyalist community groups would meet together and work together, which was, potentially unthinkable. In addition to being a community centre, it also became a place of refuge. So you literally had people coming with no names, no records were kept. They stayed for 2 or 3 days, or maybe at most a week, and then they moved on. Um, and these were bereft families with very little possessions, whose only so called crime was that they maybe were a mixed marriage, a mixed relationship, or that they had Protestant friends or Catholic friends, depending on what culture they came from. They were now I understand they were the scapegoats of different communities, and paramilitaries decided it was time that they got out. And I think so Corrymeela managed to be a centre of meeting, and in the midst of that also look after people who were very vulnerable. And there were no barriers put up, there were no gates put up. We just found a way to accommodate those people in the midst of things.
It's remarkable how those people remained safe whenever obviously they were under great threat.
Yeah,
Did
I
they?
think partly the distance from Belfast and Derry was a feature. I
Mhm.
mean, in those days, you might have got lost if you tried to find your way to Ballycastle.
Yeah.
Partly the grace of Ballycastle people, the fact that Corrymeela sits where it sits on that sort of eastern side of Ballycastle, uh, whether people realised it or not in Ballycastle, they gave Corrymeela, uh, in the good sense, a place apart status. They knew something important was happening there and it shouldn't be interfered with. And I think also partly, and I know this for a fact, that the different paramilitaries at different points fed their own people through the system to find how the system worked.
Mhm.
And the word went back, at least I was told in those days, it's a different paramilitary structure now, but I was told in those days the word went back, people are looked after, people aren't proselytized, people aren't put under pressure. And I think Ray always talked about being an open centre and an open door, and I think that was tested. Yeah.
I think that's a remarkable thing to have achieved, where people from different sections of the paramilitary world were able to come together in the same place, um, and and talk. How do you create an atmosphere like that?
I don't know. I think, um, I mean, one of the strands was, yeah, we had a number of conferences with Republican and Loyalist, meeting around political themes. Another was, and it was a time of quite, there were different views about it. We every other month or so for 2 or 3 years hosted groups of loyalists coming together for weekends to study about different responses to politics. Now, for some people, that was we were being too aligned with them. For others, they were people who you shouldn't be talking to. And yet, Ray felt and John Morrow felt, um, that it was important that these people had a space to meet and deal with issues that they normally wouldn't deal with. So I think there were a number of strands around, like the history of the Ballymurphy kids being evacuated, the work with the different paramilitary discussions, without making too much about them, but they happened. And then these study groups. So there was a sense in which, at that time anyway, we assumed that it was okay, and we assumed we were an open place, and people trusted us. So I think it was this you worked with people rather than did things for people. You listened to people rather than told people how to think. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily what you should do at the moment. I think we should express our views a lot more. But in that period of time, we were more a community that listened and heard different points of view, Our orientation was to live together and to find ways to live together. But apart from that, we didn't have, if you like, dogmatic positions. And I think that helped. I also think the staff, but also having a volunteer base, that when people came to us, they weren't coming to a centre of professionals. They were coming to a centre where there was a mixture of people who were doing their best in their paid work alongside other people who, from all parts of the world, but also from all parts of Ireland, were volunteering. And that, I think, took the sting away from people who came with a lot of suspicion. Oh, they met somebody like themselves, or they met somebody who was like their son or their daughter, doing voluntary work, because the volunteer team was very much a mixture of working class and middle class young people, um, and older people. So I think, to your question, I just think it's part of how do you become an open community. Uh, I think you have to be porous. I think you have to expand to accommodate whoever walks in through the door. I think there are notions of community that Corrymeela knows about. I don't know whether I've ever articulated it, but one of them is that community is permeable and community is expanding. You know, you expand to accommodate whoever comes. And I think that was one of the legacies of Ray and Desney and Billy McAllister.
So the time when you were leader and the times we've mostly talked about have been during the Troubles.
No, I wasn't leader, I was centre director.
Or director, sorry. Um,
Yeah,
during the Troubles. Since then, do you feel the emphasis has changed since the Good Friday Agreement, and the violent aspect of Northern Ireland has been less? Your thoughts about reconciliation, has that changed over the years?
Well,
Or
I think the focus on the violence, uh, the underbelly of the violence, always was that there were issues of poverty and inequality, and that there was issues of what you would now call systemic sectarianism. So you had these two issues that if we kept people in their different camps, then you didn't deal with the issues of poverty. Uh, and if you only focused on poverty without addressing sectarianism, you weren't necessarily finding new ways to live together. So for me, the two underlying issues, well, maybe three: sectarianism, poverty, and, if you like, a failure to see ourselves as being part of an interdependent world. Those for me are always the three dimensions of Corrymeela that implicitly we've been dealing with, if not explicitly. So I think those three issues are still there.
Mhm.
But now we have potentially the space and the freedom to deal with it because they're out in the open, and the violence isn't so all encompassing. But I'm not so sure we're making a good job of addressing sectarianism, addressing inequality, and helping people find themselves as part of a wider international world. So these three issues for me are still there, and but we now have the space and potentially the freedom to deal with them more explicitly. Um, but the issues are still the same for me.
So just looking back over your connection with Corrymeela over the years, what do you think were the most difficult times?
Uh, I've thought about this. At one level, there's always the difficulty of trying to maintain an international, if you like, a world focus, an ecumenical focus, which is the meaning of ecumenical, in a society that actually prefers to stay local and in some ways prefers to stay denominational or sectarian. That's the bigger issue. I think the most difficult times were those times around trying to maintain a centre of refuge and openness in a society that was killing one another. Um, I think looking back historically, a difficult time for Corrymeela was when we had to face the challenge of whether we were a Protestant community with Catholic friends or whether we were a community of Catholic and Protestant, which in terms of where we are now, in terms of where societies are now, it seems a crazy, but those were very important things. I always remember Cardinal O'Fee, 1978, coming to the Cree and apologising to Ray and myself that that he that he neither he nor his predecessors had ever been to Corrymeela. Um, so this struggle of uh, Catholic and Protestant to live together, um, and this Protestant reluctance to share power. I mean, I think those are some of the wider issues. I suppose looking, but I didn't really think. I think Corrymeela had some hard times, but that was our job. Our job was to deal with hard times and hard issues. So I wouldn't. I've lost my point, I think, with you, but there were difficult times, but those were the things that you should have expected. Those we're a community made to resolve difficult times,
Mm-hmm.
not a community made to retreat from difficult times.
So that was part of the purpose.
Yes, yes.
So on a happier note, what are your happiest memories of all those years?
Well, there are loads. I mean, the whole experience, to be honest. But there was a lovely moment. This is more an example. Bernard Brett was a lovely guy, a Belfast family, but he lived in Colchester. Completely disabled apart from one finger that he used to point on a board and spelled out all his questions. He didn't have a computer in those days. He had the brains of Einstein, and he had a sense of fun, such as Lenny Henry. He's that sort of character. And he would come for 3 or 4 weeks, most summers when I was there, and he would sit severely disabled, unable literally to move, but he would sit in this huge pantechnicon of a wooden chair, and he would sit in the middle of the lounge or sit outside the grass, and he would be surrounded by whoever was there, kids, adults, all talking to him through this board.
Amazing.
Totally amazing man, totally. And every so often Bernard would take worship. And Bernard took worship one evening in the Cree on being vulnerable and taking risks. Now, in those days, you never knew who would turn up for worship, sometimes 5 or 6. This time, because they all knew Bernard, the whole centre turned up. There was 100 people from the different groups in the Cree. And Bernard took this worship. Can you imagine a man who can't speak communicating through this board,
Amazing.
talking about being vulnerable and taking a risk? And then at the end of this worship, he asked Thelma, who was one of our cooks, who hadn't had an easy life, he invited her to sing. And she sang, the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, song. I mean, there was not a dry eye in the place. The silence went on for ages. It was profound. Now, that was the experience in terms of your question. There were many similar experiences, but that for me was the magic that sometimes happens in a place called Corrymeela, and it can happen in other places too. So that for me was a profound sort of moment.
A very precious moment, but as you say, a moment that was duplicated many times in different ways.
Yeah, yeah, and that ordinary people can duplicate.
Yeah,
It wasn't planned. It came out of your common life together, and I think that for me is, yeah. When I look at what Ray and others have done and how they survived some of the horrors they survived, really, we have no reason not to live in a hope-filled manner. That when people come together and are open to one another, that unexpected things happen. and that for me is faith. It is the unmasking of all those violent separating ways that keep us apart, and it's the experiencing of something different. Hey, we are different and together, which is so different to many other people and my own experience in other areas of life where we're different and apart. And but it's a relational experience out of which faith comes, rather than you know a dogma or something like that.
Derick, it's been a real pleasure
Right.
talking with you this morning.
Well,
Is there
super.
anything else you would like to say just before we wind up?
Well, I think every moment is potentially precious in a place like Corrymeela because it's about trying to build something new. I think the volunteer program over the years has been a precious thing where working class and middle class young people from these islands and internationally have experienced one another. Um, I suppose it's really just that we need to pay much more attention to how we are together. Uh, we pay to pay much more attention to learning to speak with one another about the things that the wider societies we come from don't encourage us to speak about. We'll we'll become a more reconciled society if we have the courage to take those risks of speaking together about the things that are, you know, that you're not supposed to talk about. Um, and that for me is the heart of the Christian message. It is an invitation to live together in a new way rather than the old ways of separation and judgment and yeah, condemnation, distrust. Yeah, I'll stop. I've preached too much there. Right.
An encouraging and hopeful note to finish with. Thank you very, very much, Derick.
Nice to meet you again. Take care.
Likewise.